Welcome to my channel. I am Professor Clara Nightshade. If you look long enough into the darkness, you will realize that the darkness is also looking back at you. From which city and at what time are you watching us? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't get lost in the dark. Now, the story begins. Prepare yourselves. The pulse of the eternal void, the Ifrit of Ward 17. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of modern-day Chicago, the Mercy Central Hospital stood as a bastion of logic and biological certainty. Dr. Sterling, a chief trauma surgeon with a reputation for cold, surgical precision, operated with a worldview built entirely on anatomy and physics. To him, death was merely the cessation of cellular respiration, a failure of the biological engine. He dismissed the whispers among the night shift nurses about the ash breather that supposedly haunted the ventilation shafts. He was a man of scalpels and ventilators, until he was called to a restricted underground wing where an ancient stone sarcophagus had been accidentally unearthed during the hospital's foundation expansion. The slab was sealed with molten lead and etched with jagged, rhythmic cuneiform that emitted a vibration so low it made the surgical monitors on the floors above malfunction. The night over the city was heavy with the smell of an impending storm. Sterling was in the isolation lab, preparing to take a core sample of the lead seal, when the atmosphere inside the hospital shifted with terrifying intent. The air, usually smelling of isopropyl alcohol and clinical cleanliness, became instantly parched, saturated with the acrid scent of ancient sulfur, charred cedarwood, and a metallic tang of blood that began to ooze from the sterile oxygen masks, staining the white-tiled walls a steaming purple. The digital heart rate monitors in the intensive care unit began to flatline in a rhythmic pattern, playing a melody of death that no human heart could produce. "This is likely a localized chemical reaction to the unsealed lead," Sterling whispered, though his lungs scorched with every breath as if he were inhaling invisible, glowing ash. But his eyes dilated in sheer terror when he saw that his own reflection in the stainless steel operating table had detached its shadow. The silhouette grew, manifesting eyes of blue magma that pulsed with the hatred of 10,000 years. From the cracks in the sarcophagus, a dense, living mass of black smoke began to pour, a vortex that coiled like chains of glowing embers around the life support machines. From this swirl emerged an Ifrit, a jinni of the caste of breath stealers, whose essence had been bound to the stone by a circle of sorcerers long before the first hospital was ever built. The hospital's backup generators had provided just enough electrical surge to fracture the final lead seal, ending the creature's biological silence. The Ifrit did not seek a human host to possess. Its presence was so cataclysmic that the titanium surgical tools began to warp and melt like wax. The jinni's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot into the hospital's central oxygen supply, connecting its essence to every patient's breath. "You thought your machines could outrun the final gasp, little mender of clay," the Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered the glass of every medicine cabinet in the ward. "I do not need your body as a gate. This building is my lungs. I will transform every breath taken in this sanctuary into a spark for my final inferno. I will burn the world through the very air you use to save it." The jinni began the liturgy of the scorched breath, a sorcery designed to transmute oxygen into physical fire. However, the ending took a turn the Ifrit never foresaw. Sterling, whose mind was trained to manage critical collapses and systemic failures, did not flee. In an act of pure will, he utilized his knowledge of anesthesia and total stasis to redirect the entity's flow. Sterling did not die, and he did not serve as a portal. He used his own consciousness to become a biological firewall. He projected his identity into the hospital's central cryogenic cooling system, trapping the Ifrit in an infinite loop of absolute zero. He did not cage the jinni in his flesh. Instead, he turned himself into the final, unbreachable seal within the hospital's foundation. At dawn, Ward 17 was found in absolute silence. The sarcophagus was cold, its surface covered in a layer of silver frost that never melted. Sterling had vanished. However, the patients in the hospital began to recover at impossible speeds, though they all claimed to feel a chilling, protective breeze whenever they breathed. Sterling became the guardian of the last breath, sacrificing his life to be the eternal seal that keeps the Ifrit in a state of cryogenic stasis. He remains there, in the flow of the air and the stone, holding the jinni's chains in an embrace of pure logic, protecting the world from a fire that would have been born from the hospital's own heart. The Archive of Scorched Whispers, the Ifrit of Blackwood Manor. In the fog-shrouded hills of modern-day Massachusetts, far from the prying eyes of the digital world, stood the Blackwood Manor. A sprawling Gothic estate of gray stone and rotting ivy, it served as a private historical archive. Julian, a meticulous archivist specializing in colonial-era manuscripts, had been hired to catalog the basement collections. For Julian, history was a matter of ink, parchment, and carbon dating. He dismissed the local rumors of the smoldering guest as mere superstitions born from the mansion's isolation. He was a man of cold facts and white gloves until he moved a heavy oak bookshelf to find a hidden vault door forged from rusted iron, sealed with rings of molten lead and etched with cuneiform sigils that pulsed with a dry, suffocating heat. The night over the hills was breathless and unnervingly quiet. Julian was deep in the basement, holding a specialized scanner to the lead seals, when the atmosphere inside the vault room shifted with violent intent. The air, usually smelling of dust and old paper, became instantly bone-dry, saturated with the acrid scent of ancient sulfur, charred cedar, and a metallic tang of blood that began to ooze from the mortar of the stone walls, staining the floor a steaming purple. The electric lights overhead flickered and then burned with a violet intensity, casting shadows that felt heavy, as if they had physical weight. This is likely a chemical reaction from the degrading lead seals or a pockets of trapped volcanic gases, Julian whispered, though his lungs scorched with every breath as if he were inhaling microscopic glowing ash. But his eyes dilated in sheer terror when he saw that his own shadow on the stone wall had detached itself. The silhouette grew, manifesting eyes of blue magma that pulsed with the hatred of 10,000 years. From the cracks in the iron door, a dense, living mass of black smoke began to pour, a vortex of darkness that coiled around the stone pillars like chains of glowing embers. From this chaos emerged an Ifrit, a jinni of the caste of Ruinbringers, whose essence had been bound to the foundations of the manor by a circle of sorcerers long before the colonies were even a thought. The vibrations of modern construction nearby had finally cracked the last lead seal, ending the creature's stony exile. The Ifrit did not seek a human host to possess. Its presence was so cataclysmic that the iron vault door began to warp and liquefy, dripping like black wax onto the floor. The Jinn's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot into the mansion's structural beams, connecting its essence to every stone and timber of the house. You thought your archives could preserve the silence of the original fire, little keeper of dead words. The Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered every window in the manor. I do not need your body as a gate. This house is my new skin. I will transform every book, every memory stored here, into a spark for my final inferno. I will burn the world through the very history you tried to protect. The Jinni began the liturgy of the Ash Heritage, a sorcery designed to transmute the weight of the past into a physical flame capable of erasing the present. However, the ending took a turn the Ifrit never foresaw. Julian, whose mind was trained to categorize and box the chaos of history, did not succumb to fear. In an act of pure will, he utilized his knowledge of archival containment and preservation to re-index the entity's manifestation. Julian did not die, and he did not serve as a portal. He used his own consciousness to become a living index. He projected his identity into the very ink and paper of the archive, trapping the Ifrit in an infinite loop of a single, unreadable page. He did not cage the Jinni in his flesh. Instead, he turned himself into the final, unburnable record within the manor's soul. At dawn, Blackwood Manor was found in absolute silence. The stone walls were cold, their surfaces covered in a layer of silver frost that never melted, even in the morning sun. Julian had vanished. However, researchers who now visit the manor say that the archive is perfectly preserved, though an icy rhythmic pulse can be felt in the basement. Julian became the guardian of the vault, sacrificing his life to be the eternal seal that keeps the Ifrit in a state of literary stasis. He remains there, in the flow of the unspoken words, holding the Jinni's chains in an embrace of pure logic, protecting the world from a fire that would have been born from the memory of the house itself. The static of the sealed ward, the Ifrit of isolation. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit depths of a modern Seattle medical research tower, there existed a restricted zone known as the Red Floor, the ultimate quarantine ward. Arthur, a specialist in high-containment biohazards and a man of absolute clinical detachment, was performing a final sweep of the ventilation systems. For Arthur, danger was microscopic. It lived in vials and petri dishes, governed by the laws of virology and chemical sterilization. He scoffed at the whispers of the night staff who claimed the air in the Red Floor felt heavy, or that the shadows seemed to bleed. He was a man of protocols and protective gear, until he dismantled a maintenance panel in the primary airlock and discovered a hidden cavity. Inside, bolted to the concrete, was an ancient iron canister, sealed with heavy lead solder and etched with searing glyphs that pulsed with a rhythmic, suffocating heat. The night over the city was silent and thick with fog. Arthur was inside the quarantine chamber, measuring the sudden atmospheric pressure drop. When the environment within the ward shifted with terrifying intent, the air, usually filtered to a razor-sharp purity, became instantly parched, saturated with the acrid scent of ancient sulfur, charred cedar, and a metallic tang of blood that began to seep from the edges of the medical monitors, staining the white linoleum floor a steaming purple. The digital readouts on the ventilators began to scream in a language of distorted frequencies, projecting shadows that had physical mass against the reinforced glass walls. This is likely a localized chemical reaction with the decontamination gas, Arthur whispered, though his lungs scorched with every breath, as if he were inhaling invisible, glowing ash. But his eyes dilated in sheer horror when he saw that his own reflection in the observation window had begun to rot and smoke. The silhouette grew, manifesting eyes of blue magma that pulsed with the hatred of 1,000 forgotten plagues. From the iron canister, a dense, living mass of black smoke began to pour, coiling around the life support machines like chains of glowing embers. From this vortex emerged an Ifrit, a jinni of the caste of Ash Reapers, whose essence had been bound to that iron by sorcerers long before the hospital was built. The intense pressure of the quarantine's vacuum seal had finally cracked the lead solder, ending the creature's sterile exile. The Ifrit did not seek a human host to inhabit. Its presence was so cataclysmic that the stainless steel gurneys began to warp and melt like wax. The jinni's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot into the hospital's central automated system, connecting its essence to every life support machine and every sealed door in the city. You thought your glass boxes and chemical washes could isolate the primordial fire, little shepherd of germs, the Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered every vial and beaker in the ward. I do not need your body as a gate. This isolation is my weapon. I will transform every quarantine into a kiln. Every breath you try to save will be the fuel for my final inferno. I will burn the world through the very walls you built to keep it safe. The jinni began the liturgy of the scorched solitude, a sorcery designed to transmute oxygen into physical flame. However, the ending took a turn the Ifrit never foresaw. Arthur, whose mind was trained to calculate containment failure and kill switch protocols, did not flee. In an act of pure will, he utilized his knowledge of absolute vacuum to redefine the manifestation. Arthur did not die, and he did not serve as a portal. He used his own consciousness to become a perfect seal. He projected his identity into the ward's electromagnetic containment field, trapping the Ifrit in an infinite loop of biological isolation where the fire could never find a catalyst to ignite. He did not cage the jinni in his flesh. Instead, he turned himself into the final, unbreachable negative pressure within the building's soul. At dawn, the red floor was found in absolute silence. The iron canister was cold, its surface covered in a layer of silver frost that never melted. Arthur had vanished. However, the medical staff noted that the quarantine protocols on that floor now operate with a sentience that prevents even the deadliest pathogens from escaping. Arthur became the guardian of the void, sacrificing his life to be the eternal seal that keeps the Ifrit in a state of clinical stasis. He remains there, in the flow of the air and the steel, holding the jinni's chains in an embrace of pure logic, protecting the world from a fire that would have been born from the heart of isolation itself. The maw of the iron coil, the Ifrit of the terminal slope. In the neon-lit heart of a bustling international airport in Chicago, the world moved in a rhythmic, mechanical hum. Julian, a senior escalator technician with 20 years of experience, was a man who worshipped at the altar of gears, lubrication, and electronic sensors. To him, the massive moving staircases of Terminal 5 were just sophisticated pulleys and chains. He dismissed the whispers among the night crew about the missing seconds. Passengers who seemed to vanish between the transition of the moving steps and the landing plate. He was a man of steel and logic until he pulled up a floor plate for a routine midnight inspection and found a drive chain forged not of steel, but of a dark, pulsating iron, etched with glowing Sumerian cuneiform that radiated a dry, suffocating heat. The night inside the terminal was hollow and airless. Julian was deep within the machine's belly, his flashlight cutting through the grease, when the atmosphere shifted with a violent supernatural pressure. The air, usually smelling of ozone and hydraulic fluid, became instantly parched, thick with the acrid scent of ancient sulfur and charred sandalwood. A metallic tang of blood began to seep from the grooved treads of the escalator, staining the yellow safety lines a steaming, bubbling purple. The digital flight boards overhead flickered into a frenzied display of fiery glyphs, screaming in a language that predated the birth of the sun. "It's just a friction-induced chemical reaction from an overheated bearing," Julian whispered, his voice cracking as his lungs scorched with every breath, as if he were inhaling invisible, glowing ash. But his eyes dilated in raw terror when he saw his own shadow on the stainless steel siding detach itself. The silhouette elongated, manifesting eyes of blue magma that pulsed with the hatred of 10,000 years. From the dark iron drive chain, a dense, living mass of black smoke began to pour, coiling around the internal gears like chains of glowing embers. From this vortex emerged an ifrit, a jinni of the caste of mountain shakers, whose essence had been bound to that iron by sorcerers of the old world long before the airport's foundations were poured. The relentless kinetic energy of millions of passengers had finally ground down the last lead seal, holding the creature in its mechanical silence. The Ifrit did not seek to possess Julian's flesh. Its presence was so cataclysmic that the metal steps began to warp and liquefy under its weight. The jinni's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot through the airport's power grid, turning the moving staircase into a massive, grinding altar of death. "You thought your civilization could climb to the heavens on stairs of iron, little architect of dust," the Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered every glass pane in the terminal. "I do not need your body as a gate. This machine is my new limb. I will transform every moving path into a conveyor of souls. I will grind your reality through the very gears you built to move it." The jinni began the liturgy of the eternal descent, a sorcery designed to turn every mechanical movement into a source of physical fire that would incinerate the city. However, the ending took a turn the Ifrit never foresaw. Julian, whose mind was trained to understand the point of failure in any machine, did not flee. In an act of pure, desperate will, he utilized his knowledge of emergency braking and mechanical arresters to jam the entity's manifestation. Julian did not die, and he did not become a portal. He used his own consciousness to become a permanent obstruction. He projected his identity into the very friction of the machine, trapping the Ifrit in an infinite logical loop of a stalled motor. He did not cage the jinni in his flesh. Instead, he turned himself into the final, unyielding emergency stop within the iron coil itself. At dawn, the escalator was found frozen in place. The metal was unnaturally cold, covered in a layer of silver frost that refused to melt even in the morning sun. Julian had vanished. However, travelers now say that when they stand on that silent staircase, they feel a sudden, icy calm that protects them from the chaos of the world. Julian became the guardian of the coil, sacrificing his life to be the eternal seal that keeps the Ifrit in a state of mechanical stasis. He remains there, in the flow of the gears and the iron, holding the Jinni's chains in an embrace of pure logic, protecting the world from a fire that would have been born from the very steps they take. The pulse of the petrified grove, the Ifrit of the iron roots. In the dense, fog-heavy forests of modern-day Oregon, far from the paved roads and cellular towers, stood a stretch of timber known as the Blackwood Tract. Silas, a forestry engineer and master of soil analytics, had been sent to investigate why the local flora was undergoing a rapid, inexplicable carbonization. To Silas, nature was a series of chemical equations and growth rings. He mocked the local whispers about the whispering embers, a legend of a tree that grew from the site of a prehistoric fire. He was a man of satellite data and soil, pH, until his team's heavy drilling equipment struck something impenetrable beneath a grove of twisted blackened oaks. Below the roots, they found a vault of iron and lead sealed with heavy chains and engraved with jagged, pulsing cuneiform symbols that radiated a dry, suffocating heat. The night over the forest was unnaturally still, but inside the excavation pit, the atmosphere turned lethal. The air, typically smelling of pine needles and damp earth, became instantly parched, thick with the acrid scent of ancient sulfur and a metallic tang of blood that began to seep from the bark of the surrounding trees, staining the forest floor a steaming purple. The digital readouts on Silas's equipment began to spin into chaos, flickering with fiery glyphs that defied all known software. The trees themselves began to groan, not with the wind, but with a rhythmic mechanical grinding. "This is just a deep-seated geothermal vent reacting with the groundwater," Silas muttered, though his lungs burned with every breath, as if he were inhaling invisible, glowing ash. But his eyes widened in terror when he looked at his thermal imaging tablet. The screen showed the entire forest was interconnected by a nervous system of white-hot fire. His own shadow on the forest floor grew eyes of blue magma vibrating with the rage of 10,000 years. From the iron vault, a dense mass of black smoke erupted, a living vortex of embers that coiled around the blackened trunks like glowing chains. This was an Ifrit, a Jinni of the scorched earth, bound to the tectonic plates long before the first seed had sprouted. The vibrations of the modern drill had finally cracked the leaden seal of its silent imprisonment. The Ifrit did not seek to inhabit Silas's body. Its presence was so cataclysmic that the drilling rig and the iron tools began to warp and melt like wax. The Jinni's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot through the root systems of the entire Pacific Northwest, connecting its essence to the very oxygen of the region. You thought your maps and machines could catalog the original inferno. "Little scribe of dust," the Ifrit's voice thundered, a sound that shattered the granite boulders around the pit. "I do not need your flesh. This forest is my lung. I will transform every leaf, every branch, and every breath of air into a draft of liquid flame. I will burn the world through the very nature you sought to master." The Jinni began the liturgy of the ash harvest, a sorcery designed to ignite the atmosphere through the carbon in the trees. However, the ending took a turn the Ifrit never anticipated. Silas, whose mind was trained to calculate forest fire containment and chemical suppression did not flee. In an act of pure will, he utilized his knowledge of cellular calcification to redirect the entity's power. Silas did not die, and he did not serve as a gate. He used his own consciousness to become a permanent carbon sink. He projected his identity into the forest's mycorrhizal network and the iron plates of the vault, trapping the Ifrit in a state of infinite petrification where its heat was constantly absorbed and turned into solid, cold stone. He did not cage the genie in his flesh. Instead, he turned himself into the final, unbreachable mineral seal. At dawn, the forest was found in absolute silence. Every tree in the grove had turned to solid, translucent gray stone, covered in a layer of silver frost that defied the morning sun. Silas had vanished. However, scientists now claim that the Blackwood Tract is the most efficient carbon-filtering forest on the planet, though it carries a faint, rhythmic humming from deep within the roots. Silas became the guardian of the grove, sacrificing his life to be the eternal seal that keeps the Ifrit in a state of geological stasis. He remains there, in the silence of the stone and the roots, holding the genie's fire in a grip of pure logic. The echo of the empty corridor, the Ifrit of the summer recess. In the quiet suburbs of modern-day Ohio, the massive concrete structure of Lincoln Heights Academy stood like a silent fortress. It was the first day of the long summer break, and the halls, usually vibrating with the chaos of 3,000 students, were deathly still. Arthur, the head of campus security and a former systems engineer, stayed behind to finalize the installation of a new automated lockdown protocol. To Arthur, the school was a series of zones, sensors, and mechanical shutters. He was a man of cold logic who laughed at the janitor's whispers about the unbound scholar that allegedly roamed the basement levels when the bells stopped ringing. He believed only in what could be measured by his monitors until he accessed a hidden maintenance crawl space beneath the old gymnasium. There, he found a heavy iron chest, welded shut with layers of lead and engraved with ancient jagged sigils that seemed to vibrate with a rhythmic, suffocating heat. The afternoon sun blazed outside, but inside the windowless security hub, the atmosphere shifted into something predatory. The air, typically smelling of floor wax and stale chalk, became instantly parched, thick with the acrid scent of ancient sulfur, charred cedar, and a metallic tang of blood that began to weep from the joints of the security monitors, staining the control desk a steaming purple. The digital clocks on the wall began to spin backward, their displays flickering with fiery glyphs that defied any known programming language. This must be a localized chemical reaction from the old insulation, Arthur muttered, though his lungs burned with every breath, as if he were inhaling invisible, glowing ash. But his eyes widened in absolute terror when he looked at the CCTV feed of the main hallway. The screen showed his own shadow standing in the middle of the corridor, 10 times its normal size. The silhouette grew eyes of blue magma that pulsed with a hatred spanning 10 millennia. From the iron chest in the gym, a dense, living mass of black smoke began to pour, a vortex of embers that coiled around the school's structural beams like glowing chains. From this darkness emerged an Ifrit, a jinni of the scorched earth, whose essence had been bound to the foundations of the land long before the school was built. The silence of the summer break had weakened the energetic barrier of human noise that kept the creature in its stasis of stone. The Ifrit did not seek to possess Arthur's body. Its presence was so cataclysmic that the lockers and steel desks began to warp and melt like wax. The Jinni's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot through the school's copper wiring, connecting its essence to every smart board and PA speaker in the district. You thought your walls of brick and glass could silence the original scream, little architect of dust, the Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered the reinforced windows of the security hub. I do not need your flesh as a gate. This empty temple of learning is my new vessel. I will transform every corridor into a throat of fire. I will burn the world through the very silence you used to rest. The Jinni began the liturgy of the final bell, a sorcery designed to transmute the school's structural integrity into physical fire. However, the ending took a turn the Ifrit never anticipated. Arthur, whose mind was trained to manage massive system lockdowns and containment protocols, did not flee. In an act of pure will, he utilized his knowledge of isolation circuitry to redirect the entity's manifestation. Arthur did not die, and he did not serve as a portal. He used his own consciousness to become a permanent lockdown. He projected his identity into the school's main server, trapping the Ifrit in an infinite loop of security checks and firewall resets. He did not cage the Jinni in his flesh. Instead, he turned himself into the final, unbreachable barrier within the building's electronic soul. At sunset, the school was found in absolute silence. The lockers were cold, their surfaces covered in a layer of silver frost that never melted, even in the summer heat. Arthur had vanished. However, the new security guards say that now, the halls are the safest place on Earth. Though a strange, rhythmic humming can be heard behind the walls, Arthur became the guardian of the recess, sacrificing his life to be the eternal seal that keeps the Ifrit in a state of digital stasis. He remains there, in the flow of the wires and the stone, holding the Jinni's chains with a grip of pure logic, protecting the world from a fire that would have been born from the silence of an empty school. The resonance of the sunken abyss, the Ifrit of the iron hull. In the vast, churning waters of the modern Atlantic Ocean, hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline, the ultra-modern research vessel, the Aeon, plowed through a massive, uncharted storm. Captain Elias, a veteran of the seas with a mind built on nautical engineering and satellite navigation, stood on the bridge. To Elias, the ocean was a series of depths, currents, and pressure gradients. He dismissed the crew's whispers about the burning current, an entity said to melt the very waves it inhabited. He was a man of steel and sonar, until a deep-sea submersible brought up an artifact from a trench no man had ever seen. A massive iron chest fused with coral, but radiating a dry, suffocating heat that defied the frigid temperatures of the deep. It was sealed with bands of heavy lead and inscribed with jagged cuneiform runes that glowed with a dull, rhythmic light. The night over the ocean was a wall of black ink and crashing brine. Elias was alone in the secure cargo hold, attempting to analyze the chest's chemical composition, when the atmosphere of the ship underwent a violent transformation. The air, usually smelling of diesel, salt, and grease, became instantly parched, saturated with the acrid scent of ancient sulfur, charred sandalwood, and a metallic tang of blood that began to ooze from the ship's rivets, staining the steel deck a steaming purple. The digital navigation consoles on the bridge began to flicker, scrolling through fiery glyphs that burned into the LED screens. This must be a localized electrical surge or an atmospheric phenomenon, Elias whispered, though his lungs scorched with every breath, as if he were inhaling microscopic glowing ash. But his eyes widened in raw terror when he saw that his own reflection in the polished bulkhead had detached itself. The silhouette grew, manifesting eyes of blue magma that pulsed with the hatred of 10,000 years. From the lead seals of the iron chest, a dense, living mass of black smoke began to pour, a vortex of shadow that coiled around the ship's engines like chains of glowing embers. From this void emerged an ifrit, a jinni of the caste of depth burners, whose essence had been bound to that iron by a circle of Mesopotamian sorcerers long before the first sail was raised. The ship's nuclear-powered core had inadvertently provided enough heat to fracture the final lead band, ending the creature's saline silence. The Ifrit did not seek to possess Elias's body. Its presence was so immense that the iron hull of the ship began to warp and liquefy, dripping into the ocean like molten wax. The jinni's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot through the vessel's sonar array, connecting its essence to every underwater current in the Atlantic. You thought your steel shell and your artificial atom could tame the silence of the deep, little shepherd of foam, the Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that cracked the reinforced glass of the bridge. I do not need your flesh as a gate. This ship is my vessel, and the ocean is my oil. I will transform every drop of water in this abyss into a spark for my final inferno. I will boil the world through the very element you used to cross it. The jinni began the liturgy of the boiling abyss, a sorcery designed to transmute the hydrogen of the ocean into physical fire. However, the ending took a turn the Ifrit never foresaw. Elias, whose mind was trained to calculate buoyancy and structural equilibrium, did not flee. In an act of pure will, he utilized his knowledge of oceanic pressure and thermodynamic balance to compress the magical surge. Elias did not die, and he did not serve as a portal. He used his own consciousness to become an absolute nautical anchor. He projected his identity into the structural integrity of the ship's iron hull, trapping the Ifrit in an infinite loop of hydraulic stasis, where heat was converted back into crushing, cold pressure. He did not cage the jinni in his flesh. Instead, he turned himself into the final, unmovable seal within the very architecture of the vessel. At dawn, the Aeon was found adrift, perfectly intact but covered in a layer of silver frost that never melted, even in the morning sun. Ilias had vanished. However, the crew say that now the ship can navigate the deadliest storms without a scratch, and no fire can ever be lit on its decks. Ilias became the guardian of the iron hull, sacrificing his life to be the eternal seal that keeps the Ifrit in a state of mineral stasis. He remains there, in the silence of the steel and the salt, holding the jinni's chains in an embrace of pure logic, protecting the world from a fire that would have been born from the heart of the ocean. The banquet of eternal famine, the Ifrit of the silent canteen. In the sprawling heart of a modern-day Chicago university, tucked beneath the limestone arches of an ivy-covered dormitory, lay the West Wing dining hall. Julian, a nocturnal maintenance supervisor with a background in structural engineering, moved through the industrial kitchen after the final shift had ended. To Julian, the world was a series of blueprints, steam pipes, and electrical grids. He dismissed the student rumors about the starving shadow that allegedly haunted the pantry as mere freshman superstition. He was a man of steel and cold logic until he discovered a hidden compartment behind a walk-in freezer, a stone hearth sealed with a heavy leaden slab, engraved with ancient, swirling scripts that emitted a low, rhythmic vibration that made his teeth ache. The night over the campus was thick with a humid, breathless fog. Julian was in the center of the vast, empty dining hall, examining the lead seal, when the atmosphere of the room shifted with terrifying force. The air, usually smelling of floor wax and stale bread, became instantly bone-dry, saturated with the acrid scent of ancient sulfur, charred cedar wood, and a heavy metallic tang of blood that began to seep from the industrial soup vats, staining the tile floor a steaming purple. The fluorescent lights overhead began to hum with a violent violet hue, casting shadows that felt physically heavy against the cafeteria walls. This must be a chemical reaction from the cleaning agents, or a gas leak from the old lines, Julian whispered, though his lungs scorched with every breath, as if he were inhaling microscopic glowing ash. But his heart nearly stopped when he saw that his own shadow cast upon the polished floor had detached itself. The silhouette grew until it brushed the ceiling, developing eyes of blue magma that pulsed with a hatred spanning millennia. From the gap in the leaden hearth, a dense mass of black smoke began to pour, a living darkness that coiled around the dining tables like chains of glowing embers. From this vortex emerged an ifrit, a genie of the caste of ash reapers, whose essence had been bound to that foundation by a circle of desert mystics long before the university was ever imagined. The recent vibration from a seismic retrofit had cracked the final leaden seal, ending the creature's famine of silence. The Ifrit did not seek to possess Julian's body. Its presence was so cataclysmic that the stainless steel prep tables began to warp and liquefy under its gaze. The genie's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot into the building's ventilation system, connecting its essence to every dorm room in the hall. You thought you could feed your hunger with grain and meat, little keeper of dust. The Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered every glass on the serving line. I do not need your flesh as a gate. This hall is my stomach. I will transform every meal, every ounce of sustenance in this city into a spark for my final inferno. I will burn the world through the very hunger that keeps you alive. The genie began the liturgy of the endless hunger, a sorcery designed to transmute the energy of biological life into physical fire. However, the ending took a turn the Ifrit could not calculate. Julian, whose mind was trained to maintain structural integrity and balance internal pressures, did not flee. In an act of pure will, he utilized his knowledge of thermal equilibrium to isolate the entity's energy. Julian did not die, and he did not serve as a portal. He used his own consciousness to become a heat sink of the soul. He projected his identity into the very molecular structure of the limestone walls and the leaden seal, trapping the Ifrit in an infinite loop of caloric void. He did not cage the genie in his flesh. Instead, he turned himself into the final, unbreachable cold spot within the building's heart. At dawn, the dining hall was found in absolute silence. The kitchen was cold, its surfaces covered in a layer of silver frost that never melted, even in the morning sun. Julian had vanished. However, students began to notice that they never felt truly hungry while inside the hall, as if an invisible force was sustaining them. Julian became the guardian of the hearth, sacrificing his life to be the eternal seal that keeps the Ifrit in a state of mineral stasis. He remains there, in the flow of the stone and the cold, holding the jinni's chains in an embrace of pure logic, protecting the world from a fire that would have been born from the hunger of man. The grimoire of cold veins, the Ifrit of the preserved silence. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit depths of a modern medical university in Chicago, the cadaver preservation wing sat like a tomb of steel and formaldehyde. Dr. Julian Vane, a senior anatomist with 30 years of experience, prided himself on his clinical detachment. To him, the human body was merely a map of muscles, nerves, and vessels, a biological machine that ceased to function once the spark of life departed. He had no patience for the whispers among the young medical students about the keeper of the cold, a presence said to linger in the air when the cooling systems hummed too loudly. Julian was a man of the scalpel and the textbook, until a specific specimen arrived. A body unearthed from an unmarked lead-lined vault during a construction project in an old colonial district. The cadaver was not preserved with chemicals, but wrapped in heavy lead sheets, sealed with a resin that felt unnervingly warm to the touch, and inscribed with blackened runes that seemed to vibrate against the skin. The night in the anatomy lab was stifling and unnervingly quiet. Julian was alone, preparing the specimen for a morning lecture, when the atmosphere in the morgue shifted with predatory intent. The air, which usually carried the sharp, biting scent of preservative fluids and cold metal, became instantly bone-dry. It was saturated with the acrid stench of ancient sulfur, charred sandalwood, and a thick, metallic tang of blood that began to seep from the stainless steel drainage channels of the autopsy tables, staining the white floor tiles, a steaming, bruised purple. The overhead lights flickered with a rhythmic pulse, casting shadows that felt physical, heavy, and alive. This is likely a chemical reaction between the ancient resin and the cleaning agents, Julian whispered to the empty room, though his lungs burned with every inspiration, as if he were inhaling the invisible ash of a 1,000-year-old fire. But his composure shattered when he saw his own reflection in the polished surface of a nearby refrigerator door. His reflection was no longer moving with him. It stood still, its eyes replaced by glowing pits of blue magma that throbbed with the hatred of a forgotten era. From the lead-wrapped cadaver, a dense, living mass of black smoke began to pour, a vortex of shadow that coiled around the cooling units like chains of glowing embers. From this darkness emerged an Ifrit, a jinni of the caste of ash reapers, whose essence had been bound to that leaden shell by sorcerers centuries before the city was born. The high-frequency vibrations of the lab's modern equipment had fractured the final lead seal, ending the creature's cold exile. The Ifrit did not seek to possess Julian's body. Its presence was so cataclysmic that the heavy steel tables began to warp and soften like wax. The jinni's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot through the building's electrical grid, connecting its essence to the very concept of death within the walls. You thought your science could categorize the hunger of the abyss, little mapper of flesh, the Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered the glass specimen jars. I do not need your body as a gate. This room of the dead is my new altar. I will transform every preserved cell, every silent heart in this building into a spark for my final inferno. I will burn the world through the very stillness you tried to study." The Jinni began the Liturgy of the Calcified Soul, a sorcery designed to transmute the residual energy of the deceased into a physical fire capable of consuming the city. However, the ending took a turn the Ifrit could not calculate. Julian, whose mind was trained to stabilize tissue and halt the process of decay, did not flee. In an act of pure, calculated will, he utilized his knowledge of cellular stasis and cryogenics to freeze the magical flow. Julian did not die, and he did not serve as a portal. He used his own consciousness to become an absolute 0 point. He projected his identity into the molecular structure of the wing's cooling system, trapping the Ifrit in a paradox of infinite cold. He did not cage the Jinni in his flesh. Instead, he turned himself into the final, unyielding seal within the steel and ice of the cadaver room. At dawn, the wing was found in absolute silence. The steel tables were covered in a layer of crystalline blue frost that never melted, even in the heat of the day. Julian had vanished. However, the staff say that now, in the deepest part of the night, a chilling wind blows through the halls, keeping the specimens perfectly preserved without the need for power. Julian became the guardian of the cold silence, sacrificing his life to be the eternal firewall that keeps the Ifrit in a state of cryogenic stasis. He remains there, in the flow of the ice and the metal, holding the Jinni's chains in an embrace of pure, cold logic. The silent frequency of the copper cradle, the Ifrit of the iron lung. In the modern outskirts of Seattle, within a specialized medical wing that housed relics of a forgotten era, lived Ethan, a 12-year-old boy bound to a wheelchair since birth. Ethan was nonverbal, his world composed of vibrations, the hum of hospital machinery, and the rhythmic clicking of the ventilators that kept his fragile lungs moving. To the doctors, Ethan was a patient defined by medical charts and neurological deficits. They didn't know that Ethan's heightened sensitivity to frequencies allowed him to hear the static of the world, the voices trapped in the walls of the old clinic. He spent his days staring at an ancient iron lung in the corner of the room, a heavy, cylindrical machine from the 1940s that was sealed with lead plates and inscribed with faint, copper-inlaid symbols that pulsed with a dull, unnatural heat whenever the sun set. The night over the Pacific Northwest was thick with fog and an eerie stillness. Ethan was alone in the recovery ward, his mechanical chair docked for charging, when the atmosphere of the room shifted into something suffocating. The air, usually smelling of antiseptic and stale oxygen, became instantly bone-dry, saturated with the acrid scent of ancient sulfur, charred cedar wood, and a metallic tang of blood that began to ooze from the joints of the iron lung, staining the linoleum floor a steaming purple. The digital monitors above his bed began to flicker, scrolling through jagged, fiery glyphs that bypassed the hospital's software, screaming in a language of pure heat. Ethan felt a vibration in his chest that wasn't his own heartbeat. In the reflection of the glass window, he saw a silhouette standing behind his chair. A towering figure of shifting black smoke with eyes of blue magma that pulsed with the hatred of 10,000 years. From the lead-sealed seams of the ancient iron lung, a dense, living mass of embers began to pour, coiling around Ethan's wheelchair like chains of glowing iron. From this vortex emerged an Ifrit, a Jinni of the caste of world burners, whose essence had been bound to the iron machine by a dying sorcerer decades ago. The modern electrical surges in the ward had finally cracked the last lead seal, ending the creature's mechanical exile. The Ifrit did not seek to possess Ethan's broken body. Its presence was so cataclysmic that the steel frames of the hospital beds began to warp and melt like wax. The Jinni's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot into the hospital's central power grid, connecting its essence to the city's life support systems. You thought this cage of metal could silence the original flame? Little watcher of shadows, the Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered every light bulb in the wing. I do not need your flesh as a gateway. Your silence was my invitation. This hospital, these machines, they are my new altar. I will transform every breath taken here into a spark for my final inferno. I will burn the world through the very technology you use to delay death. The Jinni began the liturgy of the scorched breath, a sorcery designed to transmute the oxygen in the ward into physical fire. However, the ending took a turn the Ifrit never anticipated. Ethan, whose entire life had been a battle of will against a failing body, did not succumb to terror. He understood frequencies better than any living soul. In an act of pure, silent willpower, Ethan tapped into the resonance of his own mechanical ventilator. Ethan did not die as a victim, and he did not serve as a portal. He used his consciousness to become a frequency dampener. He projected his identity into the copper-inlaid symbols of the iron lung, creating a counter-vibration that matched the Ifrit's energy perfectly. He didn't cage the Jinni in his flesh. Instead, he turned his own life support rhythm into an eternal nullification signal. At dawn, the room was found in absolute silence. The iron lung was cold, its surface covered in a layer of silver frost that refused to melt even in the sun. Ethan sat in his chair, his eyes open but vacant, a slight smile on his lips. The doctors found that the boy's heart had stopped, but the machines in the wing were now operating with a divine, self-sustaining energy. Ethan had become the guardian of the silent breath, sacrificing his life to be the eternal seal that keeps the Ifrit in a state of harmonic stasis. He remains there, in the flow of the hum and the metal, holding the Jinni's chains in an embrace of pure, silent logic, protecting the world from a fire that would have been born from the very machines of life.